Welcome back to our Land Bulletin series. I'm Haley Mirr, and I am the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Development here at Mirr Ranch Group. This is the Land Bulletin where every other week we discuss the ranch and sporting property market, buying and selling advice, the latest best stewardship practices, as well as topics currently impacting landowners. Mirr Ranch Group is a full-service ranch real estate brokerage and consulting company focusing on legacy ranches and sporting and conservation properties around the West. Today, we're going to be focusing on something very specific, and we're looking mostly in Wyoming, but it's something that is definitely important throughout the West. Ungulate herds across the West rely on migration corridors to move twice a year between their winter and summer ranges. These corridors are vital habitats for these animals, and the ability to surf the green wave accurately is critical for their species. Development in migration corridors, whether in the form of rural residential subdivisions, oil and gas fields, or solar or wind farms, can be adversely affect migration and populations. However, these critical habitats on private lands can be protected by taking advantage of the tools that have been made available by different NGOs. Today, we will be speaking with someone closely tied to one such NGO, the Knobloch Family Foundation, to see how we can work to minimize the development in migration corridors while maintaining their functionality and perpetuity. Helping me out today with the conversation is the MRG Wyoming partner and board member of Wyoming Stock Growers Land Trust, Jared Souza. Welcome, Jared.
How are you today?
I'm lovely. How are you doing, sir?
Oh, good.
It's hard to get a hold of you, Jared. You're off on ranches almost every other day, it seems like. So I'm glad you had the time to talk with us today.
Yeah, no, I appreciate getting the chance to talk about something that means a lot to me today, and having Steve Sharkey join us. So
awesome. Well, I'll let you because you know Steve very well and you work closely with him at Wyoming Stock Growers Land Trust. So I'll let you kind of introduce Steve before bringing him on.
Yeah, so Steve Sharkey's joining us today. Steve and I serve on the board of the Wyoming Stock Growers Land Trust together, and I've been able to kind of develop a relationship with him over the last few years. But Steve spent the majority of his career in the investment business and is now the director of two foundations. One notably is the Knobloch Family Foundation, and they focus on conservation of valuable wildlife habitat and working landscapes across primarily Wyoming and a couple other western states, and obviously are a big supporter of the Wyoming Stock Growers Land Trust.
Awesome. Well, without further ado, welcome Steve to the show.
Thank you, Haley. Thanks, Jared. I'm delighted to participate in one of your podcasts.
Awesome. Well, it's so good to see you again. We met each other at the Wyoming Stock Growers Land Trust Barbecue last year. Really cool event, but it's good to see you again on the Land Bulletin. So those of you who are joining are probably wondering, what is the Knobloch Family Foundation? Some of you probably know what it is, but Steve, I'd love to hear from your point of view. What is the foundation? Kind of why does it exist, and what are your kind of goals in Wyoming specifically?
Sure. The Knobloch Family Foundation was set up by Carl Knobloch, and I'm a director of the foundation. Carl is an uncle by marriage. He married my father's sister. The other members are his wife and his daughters. Carl unfortunately died in 2016, but Carl was an extremely talented and successful businessman, entrepreneur, investor, and spent most of his life behind a desk. But he grew up on a farm in Connecticut, and he learned there to love nature. He ran trap lines. He loved to hunt and fish. His father liked to hunt and fish, and they'd go up into the north woods of Maine. And so it was always, nature was always important to him and a passion. And he wanted to do something to help conserve good natural ecosystems. So the foundation focuses primarily on conservation of valuable wildlife habitats. And it works not just in Wyoming and contiguous states in the Intermountain West here, but its focus has really been on land protection in areas where Knobloch family members live. So he's spent a lot of time in Georgia, and he's got a daughter who does a lot of work there now. One daughter lives in Texas and does a lot of work there and has a big program on conservation of shorebirds and grassland birds. And my work has been primarily in Wyoming, focused primarily on how to maintain robust herds of native ungulates on the landscape, because we think that's probably the best way to keep the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and other fine western intermountain ecosystems functioning at a high level of perpetuity. If we can keep these animals on the landscape, that goes a long way to making everything good.
And those of you who are listening might not know what ungulate is. So, Steve, do you mind telling us kind of, especially in Wyoming, when you talk about ungulates, what type of herds are you referring to?
Absolutely. So, in Wyoming, we have 7 native ungulates. We've got 1 non-native, and the ungulates that provide most of the biomass in the ecosystem are elk, mule deer, and pronghorn. But then we've got some other fabulous animals in the form of bighorn sheep, moose, bison, and white-tailed deer. It's a native ungulate. So ungulates are hoofed animals. And then there's one other species that occurs in a few parts of the state, and that's mountain goats.
Okay. Thank you. I know I know it. Jared knows it, but it's good to also teach what some of these kind of more scientific terms are. So I appreciate that. So with some of those ungulates, what is the threat that we have started to see, especially in Wyoming? I know you've given us a couple examples when we've been talking in the past, but what is the threat that we are seeing to these migratory corridors?
Well, Haley, as you mentioned, migratory corridors are critical habitat for these animals. And unfortunately, over the last several decades, populations of pronghorn and mule deer, Wyoming historically had at least half of the pronghorn in North America. They've fallen by approximately 50% from somewhere between 500 and 600,000 animals 30 years ago to half that level today. And the numbers are roughly the same for mule deer. Now, elk, on the other hand, have been doing quite well. They have a lot of plasticity, as the biologists call it. They're very adaptable animals, and their populations have actually increased in Wyoming and most of the West. So those are the 3 species we focus on. And the moose, bighorn sheep, they occur at fairly low population levels. Again, fabulous animals. We do things for them. But the threats to mule deer and pronghorn have been a development on their migration corridors and winter habitats. And you mentioned the various types of developments: rural residential subdivisions, oil and gas development, and renewables. Now, those are the main threats. And one thing the foundation does is it focuses on conserving these important habitats. But the first step is to fund the science and research to identify those habitats. It's really only become possible in about the last 10 to 15 years with the advent of GPS collars that we could put on these animals to know how they move across the landscape. Our foundation is not opposed to development, energy development. Carl Knobloch, a lot of his wealth came from an oil field service company, and he used to do work in southwestern Wyoming. So our goal is to maintain these corridors, and that doesn't preclude development in other areas. Mm-hmm. But what we want to do is keep that development off of corridors and winter ranges, those really valuable habitats to these animals.
And I know, we'll talk about a couple different NGOs that are starting to create these tools that are available to private landowners. But are there any other organizations out there who are trying to help this threat other than kind of these NGOs as the state or federal government? Are they, do they have tools at their disposal that they're using to protect these migratory corridors?
Well, they do. Wyoming Game and Fish Department does a tremendous amount of good research and advocacy for conservation. And a few years ago, Governor Gordon signed an executive order that helped designate several deer migration corridors for conservation, and hopefully that will lead to other designations. So, the state's certainly doing a good job there, and so a lot of this research comes out of the Wyoming Migration, which is housed in the Cooperative Research Unit down at University of Wyoming, like Wyoming Game and Fish Department in-house research unit. And quite often these migration research projects by us through the Wyoming Migration Initiative and other funders, other foundations, and and conservation groups like Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and Muley Fanatics, and then Game and Fish puts in money into these research projects. So there are a lot of entities, advocacy organizations, land trusts, foundations, private foundations like ours, and state and federal agencies that are trying to do things to, help conserve these migrations and these animals, allow them to continue to persist at significant numbers in the West.
Great. And so with the Knobloch Family Foundation, what is the process that you guys go through and the tools at your disposal that you use to protect these migratory corridors? And then secondly, what are the areas that you guys are focusing on primarily in Wyoming?
So we use that research to identify which lands have the most valuable habitats. And then the primary mechanism for protecting private lands from development is a conservation easement, which is done with a land trust. There are 7 or 8 land trusts that are active in Wyoming. Our foundation works with all of them. I went on the board of the Stock Growers Land Trust, where I got to know Jared, because it's become by far the most active land trust in the state. We're trying to accelerate conservation of these private lands. So that's the reason for doing that. But that's the primary tool for protecting these migration corridors on private lands. Where they cross public lands, advocacy conservation organizations like Wyoming Wildlife Federation, Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, Wyoming Outdoor Council, the Wilderness Society, those kind of organizations work on policy to protect those habitats on public lands.
Okay. And where are kind of the projects that you guys are working on currently in Wyoming?
Well, we'll work on projects just about all over the state, except and we work on things in southwestern Wyoming, up in the High Divide area, which we think is terrific, and in eastern Idaho. We don't do a lot, unfortunately, over in the eastern part of Wyoming, just because it's a long way from where I live in the western part of the state. But I guess if I had to say what are our main areas of focus in the state, there's probably 3 areas that have very valuable private lands for wildlife. And that would be the Upper Green River Basin and the Absaroka Front over by Cody, off to the east of Yellowstone, and the area around Du Bois and Du Nord, spreading into the Wind River Reservation. Those I'd say are probably our 3 areas of focus, but we also do projects down around Saratoga, Wyoming, in the southern part of the state, down around Baggs. Again, these are great Western ecosystems, and they have great wildlife.
And what constitutes, from your research, I'm kind of going off, topic a little bit, but from research, what constitutes like a very dangerous a restriction on a migratory corridor? I know we've talked about bottlenecks before, things like that. When you look at these research from the Wyoming Fish and Wildlife, what are you really looking for as this big threat?
Well, the biggest threat would be a true bottleneck that could be blocked with development. And I'll give you an example of one of our more successful conservation projects. Years ago, many people here might have heard of the Red Desert to Hoback mule deer migration. This is the longest mule deer migration in North America. It's about the longest ungulate migration in the lower 48 states. The only animals that tend to move farther are barren ground caribou. So it's a 150-mile migration where these deer winter down by I-80 and they end up in the Hoback Basin, close to Jackson Hole. Some deer have even gone over into Idaho. One deer has gone 240 miles. So that tells you how far some of these animals will move. But all of those animals, 4,000 to 5,000 deer, went through a very narrow, a real bottleneck at the outlet of Fremont Lake near Pinedale. And that outlet, there was about a quarter mile of land there that wasn't developed from subdivisions that had spread out from Pinedale up towards Fremont Lake and the outlet of the lake itself. Some deer actually swim across the bottom end of the lake on their migration. Mm-hmm. And that was private property. It was for sale. It was considered to be the top threat on that migration corridor. And I had a great friend, Luke Lynch, who used to work for the Conservation Fund. He tragically died in a mountaineering ski accident 8 years ago. But I contacted Luke, who worked for the Conservation Fund, and I showed him this on a map. It was an assessment done by Hall Sawyer and Matt Kaufman through the Wyoming Migration Initiative. I said, this is the number one threat. So Luke immediately went down there and saw the property was for sale. And I told him I'd get our foundation to put up half of the price to purchase the property. And then we helped raise the rest of the funds. And the Conservation Fund bought it and ultimately transferred the property to Wyoming Game and Fish Department, which owns it now. And it's a wildlife habitat management area for game and fish. But that's an example of a really serious threat. And one thing I'll say is you're never going to protect a long migration corridor perfectly. What we try to do is look at the research and the data and try to identify where the biggest risks are, and then try to eliminate 2 or 3 of those risks, because the goal is to maintain functionality and perpetuity. Any development you get on a corridor can have adverse impacts, but the goal is to make sure that bottlenecks don't get clogged up. And then these animals use stopovers, on their migrations in springtime, they might spend 90 to 95. So the red desert to hoback mule deer migration, that takes those animals 2 months in the spring to move from the southern end down by I-80 up to the hoback. They're traveling for 2 months. They're foraging along the way. That's why it's really critical habitat. But 90 to 95% of that 2-month period is spent on what are called stopover areas. And so stopover areas are really important in migration corridors. You don't want development on stopover areas.
Okay. And I guess as you are talking about this, it seems like, and we touched on it a little bit, but Jared, I know you have some clients that have used tools available, but private landowners seem to play a very important role in protecting kind of these bottleneck areas. Like you said, one private landowner had one piece for sale, and if it had been sold to a developer, that could have really been detrimental to the entire migratory corridor. So selling to, that was kind of a special example. But what are tools, like if you want to hold on to your landscape, protect it, what are tools available to some landowners? And I guess, Jared, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I kind of want to back up a little bit because I want to talk about migration corridors and then ungulate populations a little bit. But so the difference is like Steve was saying, so 150 miles long is a migration corridor in western Wyoming, and the difference between like western Wyoming or central Wyoming compared to where I live is like we're not a huge focus for our ungulates as far as migration corridors, because our migration corridors are very small, short, and sometimes they may an elk herd may live on the same property 12 months out of the year. But what Steve was saying, so let's say you shorten that 150 miles to where they can only migrate 70 miles. The downside is the habitat and climate that's devastating to that wildlife herd. They simply cannot survive in that area if they can't migrate, and that's what you're seeing. That's why there's so much interest in the overpasses and everything else, just to make that travel a lot easier for them. Just because of the climate versus, southeastern Wyoming, we don't have that issue with the climate. We Chinook off, and we got a lot more availability to where an animal can survive without migrating 150 miles, so that's interesting. The other thing about ungulate populations is that's a complicated issue. Conservation's complicated. Ungulate population is complicated, right? You got a lot of other, I guess, people and things that need to utilize that same ground, right? So you got cattle that's grazing the ground, you got ungulates that are grazing the ground, you got the sportsman that needs opportunity, you got people that are interested in trophies. So the game and fish's job and hands off to biologists and their effort. There's no easy answer to anything. We got issues in the southeastern Wyoming where our elk population's at all times high. We got way above their management objective, and we got a lot of private lands. Well, we have limited harvest rates, and it's hard for the game and fish to get the numbers back down. So you got ranchers that are losing food resource and grazing resource to their cattle. So it's a slippery slope. If we kill all them elk off and get back to lower numbers, well, then the sportsmen in Wyoming are suffering because the opportunity to harvest elk drops substantially. So we're always kind of treading a thin line of making the animals survive, and then managing alongside there, and kind of no matter what direction you go, it's you're kind of, I guess, upsetting someone on the other side of the table. So it kind of makes it complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's never easy. So those, with that in mind, different management techniques, to your point, Jared, of, the recreational component, the conservation component, for landowners. I know we've talked about some like easements as being a tool if a landowner does feel like they need to manage it for that purpose.
Yeah. And I'll speak to that as far as habitat and private land. So the interesting thing is, and you don't hear about this in a lot of circles, but ranchers and private landowners in general support a lot of ungulate populations. And in fact, there's some ungulate populations that exist only because of private land ownership. Irrigated lands, you got water development, etc. All these things that good managers do on a good ranch. When they develop water resources, it's not, the cattle aren't the only thing to benefit from that. I got trail cameras on a whole bunch of stock tanks that were put in by man that elk and deer are using on a daily basis in places that there was no water available to any wildlife population, that all of a sudden they got a water resource available because man put it there. And on the irrigated land component, and obviously it's different as you change landscapes if you go to Western Wyoming, but there's places that we're irrigating and alfalfa and corn or whatever that normally wouldn't support the numbers of wildlife in that area ever before historically, because in a natural setting. But now, because of the increased forage available, it supports greater numbers of elk or antelope or deer, and I see that a lot more in my neck of the woods, but it dang sure exists elsewhere.
And I guess, we've talked about tools at the disposal, how Knobloch has been able to focus on some of these different areas. In your opinion, guys, what is what are your predictions for the future of some of these migratory corridors in Wyoming? What landowners can do, what communities can do, and where do you see the next threat? And I guess, Steve, I'll start with you.
Well, again, I think keeping these corridors open to allow these animals to continue to move between their winter and summer ranges is critical. And, Jared made a good point about elk in particular. They're really smart animals. And the former manager of the National Elk Refuge works for me part-time. And he's a consultant to our foundation. That's the way I should characterize it. And, I made a comment one time. I said, elk know on which side of a fence they're hunted, because you can be hunting on one ranch and you can have a whole herd bedded just across the fence. They know they're safe. And his name's Steve Callan. Steve laughed and he said, they don't even need a fence, because on the National Elk Refuge years ago, there used to be no hunting permitted on the south end, but there was no fence there. It was just, there were some markers that people could look to see where that boundary was. He said those elk knew when they got across it. And one thing we've seen in the West is a lot of shifting in elk herds from being migratory to non-migratory. We don't see that same thing so much in mule deer and pronghorn in the western part of the state. And, I think, our focus is just on maintaining that habitat. You can make management mistakes. Game and Fish can maybe issue too many tags, and suppressed numbers or maybe not enough tags, and you can get a bad die-off like we had in Southwest and Southern Wyoming in this past winter. It wasn't because not enough tags had been issued. It was just a super hard winter. But as long as you maintain that habitat, the animals can rebound. And again, these easements that we work on, the goal is to eliminate development rights. Landowners get either paid fair value for the easement or they get a donation, a tax deduction equal to the fair value of the easement. They continue to own the land. The land can continue to appreciate. It's a good deal for landowners, and it's a good deal for wildlife. I'm not sure. And you were saying the long-term threats. Did I address that or no? Maybe I didn't.
No, yeah, no, that was great. And we were just chatting a little bit before this call just about even the heightened interest in conservation, and especially in landowners. And it seems like, in your opinion, you guys work with Wyoming stock growers pretty closely. Are you seeing an increased interest in kind of easements and what those mean for landowners?
Yeah, I guess I can kind of speak to that. That's one great thing since my involvement with Wyoming Stock Growers Land Trust, and from selling real estate for the last 13 years or whatever, is there's definitely an increased interest in conservation and stewardship in general, which is great, because that's kind of my focus in my career, and obviously Mirr Ranch's focus as far as our branding and everything is we're in the business to sell ranches, but we also, I guess, are in the business to find stewards of the land. And there's a ton of different vehicles to be a good steward of the land, whether it's conservation easements or whatever else. But when you buy a big ranch, you got an incredible duty, and you shoulder a lot of weight. There's a lot of responsibility. You can't just buy it and just sit around and do nothing, because there's a lot of things that rely on that particular landscape, not just yourself driving around on a UTV,
Even though that part's fun too.
Yeah, it is fun, but
with the Knobloch Family Foundation, Steve, is there a current initiative you guys are working on, or is it continuing to work with these different organizations with the research that they provide to figure out what the next endangered area would be?
Well, it's all, Haley, I would say it's pretty much all endangered in the Intermountain West now. I think the biggest threats going forward over the next couple decades are going to be rural residential subdivision on private lands and renewable energy development. That has the same impacts, big wind farms and solar farms. Again, we're not opposed to that, but we sure don't want them in high value wildlife habitats. Mm-hmm. So we're just continuing to do the same thing. There's still some research to fund. The Wyoming Migration Initiative now has collected data on over 60 migration corridors. There's probably about 100 significant ones in the state. Jared made a good point about elk in his area. And it's probably true for pronghorn, I guess, and mule deer too, Jared. They often don't need to move long distances. And we see a lot of that in Montana. I think in Colorado, a lot of these animals might make a short jump from national forest just a few miles down into the low valleys where they'll spend the winter on private ranches. And again, so that's critical winter range for those animals that we want to not see developed. But we'll just keep, we've got to keep doing the same thing. And we focus on identifying these important habitats, and we make that information available to the land trusts so that when they have landowners who are interested in doing something, they know that there are groups like ours that are interested in, funding easements, or there are other payment streams too available to landowners, fence modifications to wildlife friendly standards, invasive treatments, especially for cheatgrass. There are now habitat leases through a new USDA pilot program in 5 parts of Wyoming. So there are a lot of benefits potentially available to a landowner who has valuable habitat on the property.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Well, I've learned a lot today, and I don't know, Jared, if you had any other comments you wanted to make from a landowner's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I could go on and on, but you know, it's just important, and you know, I guess as far as you know, anyone considering buying a ranch or whatever, that it's you know, we do a good job, and obviously, I got a lot of experience with that through you know managing ranches or running my outfitting business or whatever. But there's a lot of things that you got to take in account for, you know, and like Steve said, we're not anti-development by any stretch of the imagination. Like we understand for a you know an economy to survive and thrive, you got to have some development out there, but it needs to be strategic, and we also need to do some conservation at the same time, because at the end of the day, you know, the population keeps expanding, and the need for additional housing and land and everything else is going to continue to increase. But if we want to still be able to see elk and mule deer and antelope running around on the interstate when you're driving from place to place, then we got to do something about it. Otherwise, we're not going to have anything.
Hmm. And it seems like all the organizations you guys have talked about today, as long as we're all kind of listening to each other and talking to each other and using the research available to us, a lot of that is able to happen and have some development and have people have places they can live. Because it seems like too, the population of Wyoming especially is growing day by day, because people have kind of figured out how incredible that state is. So working with organizations like the Knobloch Family Foundation, Wyoming Stock Growers for those easements, it's all crucial. It's like a puzzle to make sure that these migratory corridors are taken care of.
Haley, that is a great analogy. It's exactly like a puzzle, a really complicated puzzle.
It is a complicated puzzle.
But it seems like you guys are, you know, starting to figure out how to put it together. And you guys have some good people on the ground up there in Wyoming. And it's a state I love. So it's good to know that you guys are taking care of it.
Yeah, and I'll put in a little plug, you know, specific to Wyoming Stock Growers Land Trust. And I think, you know, for one, we're you know, all the habitat and the migration corridors and all that stuff. It's all important, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the great thing is there's an added benefit there, and that's you know we're preserving working landscapes.
Mm-hmm.
So these places are ranched and farmed, and you know part of Wyoming heritage, and they're family run or organizations or operations for you know several years, maybe multi-generational type stuff. But you know these guys have been stewarding the land for generations and generations, and now you know there's just an extra vehicle to help preserve that asset that great grandpa or whoever you know built up and developed. And that's the great thing. So you know the landscape's not changing. It's
Mm-hmm.
going to still run cattle, it's still going to do everything it's done historically, but the great thing is that migration corridor benefits from that at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, guys. Thank you for our listeners for joining us today, either on the live stream or on the podcast. And thank you, Jared, for helping me out with the conversation. And Steve, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us to talk about this important thing happening in Wyoming and across the West. And I appreciate you coming on the show.
Well, you're welcome, Haley. It was my pleasure.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah,
see you
thank you,
guys.
Dave.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Jared. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks.
And if you're interested in learning more about what easements can do for you, if you're a landowner or thinking of purchasing a ranch, contact your local or regional land trust and see what can happen on your property. And if you want to learn more about ranch real estate or our ranch marketing process, please be sure to subscribe to our newsletter on our website at www.mirranchgroup.com or give us a call at 303-623-4545. Thanks so much. See you next time.